My name is Irina Vasquez. I am 33 years old. And 11 years ago, a man I had known for less than 40 minutes bought me a cup of tea, asked me what I wanted to do with my life, and waded through my entire answer without checking his phone once. I did not know what to do with that. I was 22 years old, and I had spent the better part of my childhood being the person in the room that people forgot to factor in, and someone sitting still while I spoke felt so unfamiliar that I actually stopped mid-sentence and looked at him to see if he had fallen asleep with his eyes open. He hadn't. He was watching me with the particular attention of someone who finds the thing in front of them genuinely interesting. His name was Edmund Chu. He was 64 years old, recently widowed, and he had come into that bookshop on Clement Street in San Francisco on a Tuesday afternoon in March because his wife had loved it, and he wasn't sure what else to do with a Tuesday afternoon anymore. He died 14 months ago. He left me his estate. The estate included a house in the Sunset District, a brokerage account, a modest art collection, and a sum of money that I am not going to describe in full because this story is not about the money. It was never about the money. But I will tell you that when the obituary ran in the San Francisco Chronicle on a Sunday morning in November, my parents read it in the house I grew up in Fresno, 185 miles away. And within 53 minutes of the paper hitting their porch, my mother called the number she had for me, the number I had quietly changed 3 weeks earlier, for reasons entirely unrelated to them, or so I had told myself. She got a disconnect message. She called my brother Daniel next. Daniel called my cousin Priya. Priya sent me a text at 10:47 a.m. that said, "Your mom is trying to reach you. She sounds upset." I read the text. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I made a second cup of coffee. And I sat with the specific quality of that silence for a long time before I decided what to do with it. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you what I decided and what my parents said when they finally found a way to reach me, tell me where you are right now. Tell me what season it is outside your window, what the light looks like where you're sitting. I ask because this is a story about what happens when you spend years being told you are the easy one to leave behind, and I want you settled somewhere real before I take you back to where it started. Because where it started was a long time ago, and it takes a few minutes to get there, and I think it's better if you're comfortable. My parents are not villains. I want to say this at the outset clearly because I think the most honest version of this story requires it. They are two ordinary people who made a series of small, cumulative choices over many years, none of which was ever dramatic enough on its own to call cruel, but which together formed a pattern as consistent and load-bearing as any structure I have ever seen. My mother's name is Luz. My father's name is Roberto. They have been married for 38 years. They go to the same church they've attended since before I was born, and they love their children, both of us, in the specific way that parents love children when they have decided, without quite realizing they've decided, that one of them requires more careful handling than the other. Daniel was the one who required careful handling. He was 2 years older than me, and from early childhood, he was the kind of person who filled a room with a quality of need that was impossible to ignore. Not manipulative, not intentionally, just genuinely and constitutionally more requiring of attention, more reactive to disruption, more visible in his distress. When Daniel was unhappy, the whole house reorganized around his unhappiness. When Daniel was happy, the whole house brightened. He was, in the vocabulary I learned much later, the identified patient, the one through whom the family's emotional weather moved. I was the other kind of child. The kind who learned very early that things went more smoothly when I was not adding to the ambient difficulty. I became, with practice and over years, extremely good at not adding to the ambient difficulty. I helped without being asked. I adjusted without complaint. I said okay, and I meant it, or I said it so consistently that the distinction between meaning it and performing it eventually dissolved entirely. What this looked like in practice: Daniel went on the family trip to Oaxaca in the summer of 2005 when I was 11 and he was 13 because the year before I had been the one who got car sick on the drive to his baseball tournament, and my parents had decided, based on this, that long trips were hard for me. I stayed with my grandmother for 2 weeks and was told I would go next summer. I did not go the next summer. I did not go the summer after that either. By the summer of 2008, when I was 14, the trip to Oaxaca had become a fixture of family life that involved 3 people, and my absence from it had become a fixture of the same kind: unremarkable, administrative, simply how things were organized. My mother's explanation, the one time I asked directly, came on an evening in April 2009. I was 15. It was a Wednesday, 7:23 p.m., and I had come into the kitchen while she was making dinner, and I had said, in the most careful and even voice I could manage, "Why doesn't anyone ever ask if I want to go?" She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, not unkindly, not cruelly, in the tone of someone explaining something they believe to be self-evident, "Daniel is just easier to bring. You understand, Irina." I said yes. I said I understood. I went to my room and I sat on my bed and I looked at the wall for approximately 9 minutes and then I opened my homework and did it. My father, when I came to him later that week with the same question, I was thorough. As a child, I believed in gathering information from all available sources, shrugged in a way that I can only describe as the physical embodiment of the same sentence. Not dismissive, exactly. More like, this is simply how things have been calibrated, and recalibration at this point would require effort nobody had budgeted for. I want to be precise about the dollar amounts involved in the years of family life, because precision is important and because vagueness would make this story feel less real than it was. My parents were not wealthy, but they were stable. My father worked as a supervisor at a food distribution center earning $67,400 per year, and my mother worked part-time at a dental office earning $28,700. They owned their house on Millbrook Drive outright by 2011 when I was 17, having made the final mortgage payment of $1,247 in March of that year. They had enough. They had more than enough. When Daniel needed a car for his job at 21, they bought him a used Honda Civic for $8,300. When Daniel's rent in Sacramento was difficult for him for 3 months in the spring of 2014, they transferred $1,850 per month into his account. I know these specific numbers because Daniel told me at the time, with no particular awareness that the telling might land differently for me than he intended. I never asked my parents for money. Not because I had enough. For most of my early 20s, I had the specific kind of not enough that teaches you to be excellent at mental arithmetic, but because somewhere in childhood I had absorbed the understanding that the family's financial cushion was a resource calibrated around Daniel's needs, and that inserting myself into that calibration would require a kind of assertion I had not learned to make. I graduated from Fresno State in May 2013 with a degree in English literature and a student loan balance of $22,400. I had paid for my own education primarily through a combination of scholarships, a part-time job at the campus writing center, and a weekend shift at a coffee shop on Blackstone Avenue, where I worked from September 2011 through to graduation. I moved to San Francisco in August 2013 with $3,847 in a checking account, a rolling suitcase, and a sublet arranged through a listing site for a room in an apartment on Irving Street. My parents helped Daniel move to Sacramento that same month. They rented a van. They took 2 days. My mother made tamales for his freezer. I took a bus to the Caltrain station and a train to the city. Nobody came with me. I said it was fine. It was, in the way that things become fine when you have decided that fine is the available category. I found work within 3 weeks of arriving in San Francisco, a junior editorial assistant position at a small independent publisher on Valencia Street, paying $38,200 per year. The work was detailed, underpaid, and I loved it with a specificity that surprised me. I read manuscripts. I wrote coverage reports. I learned, under the supervision of a senior editor named Patricia Osei, who had been in publishing for 22 years, and who ran her department with the precision and warmth of someone who had found exactly the right use for herself, what it meant to read a piece of writing and understand not just what it was doing but what it was trying to do, and where the gap between those two things could be closed. Patricia Osei is the first named professional I want you to hold on to in this story. Not because of what she did in any legal or structural sense, but because she is the person who, in the spring of 2014, first said to me plainly, "You are very good at making yourself invisible in this office. It is not serving you." She said this at 4:15 p.m. on a Thursday, standing in the doorway of the small room where I worked, and she did not soften it or walk it back. "You write the best coverage notes in this department. Nobody senior knows that yet, because you don't tell them. That is a choice you are making, and I want you to understand that it is a choice. I thought about what Patricia said for several days. I thought about it in the context of a habit that predated my career, a habit that predated San Francisco and Fresno State and all of it, a habit that had begun when I was 11 years old and standing in a doorway watching my family pack for Oaxaca. The habit of making myself easy to overlook. The habit of saying okay. I did not change overnight, but I started signing my coverage reports with my full name instead of my initials. I started speaking in the Tuesday editorial meetings instead of writing my comments down and passing them to Patricia afterward. These were small movements, but they were in a direction, and direction matters more than distance in the early stages of becoming someone different than you have been. I met Edmund Chu on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2014, 7 months after I moved to San Francisco. I had gone into the bookshop on Clement Street on my lunch break because Patricia had mentioned a particular book about the editor Maxwell Perkins, and I wanted to find it. Edmund was in the biography section when I came in, standing with a book open at a page he didn't seem to be reading, and I said excuse me when I needed to reach past him, and he stepped aside and looked at what I'd taken from the shelf and said, "That's a good one. Are you in publishing?" We talked for 20 minutes in the aisle. Then we went to the tea shop next door and talked for another hour and 40 minutes. I missed my entire afternoon at work and texted Patricia to say I was sick, which was the first lie I had told in a professional context in my life, and which I confessed to her the next morning, and which she responded to with a long look and then, "Was it worth it?" I said yes, she said. Then it was the right call. Edmund was, I learned over the course of that first conversation, and the many that followed, a retired architect who had spent 30 years running a mid-sized firm in the city before stepping back at 60 to care for his wife, Margaret, through a long illness. Margaret had died in January 2014, 2 months before I met him. They had no children. They had been married for 39 years. He talked about her with the particular quality of someone who is still in the process of understanding that a thing is gone, not grief-stricken in the acute sense, but not yet recalibrated to a world without her in it. I want to be careful about how I describe what Edmund and I were to each other over the 11 years between that Tuesday afternoon and his death, because it has been described incorrectly by people in my family, and I prefer the accurate version. He was not a romantic interest. He was not a father figure in the sense that implies replacement or substitution. He was, with increasing precision over 11 years, a person who saw me clearly and found what he saw worthy of serious attention. He asked questions about my work and remembered the answers. He disagreed with my opinions when he disagreed and told me why, without softening. He pushed back when I defaulted to invisibility, which I did with some frequency for the first several years of knowing him, and he did this not with impatience but with the steady, unhurried quality of someone who has decided that patience is the correct instrument for this particular situation. He introduced me, in September 2015, to a literary agent named David Fong at a dinner party he hosted at his house in the Sunset. David Fong had been a prominent agent at a San Francisco agency for 18 years and was known in publishing circles for his work with narrative nonfiction. Edmund introduced me with a specificity that I did not expect. He had read my coverage reports, which I had shown him, and he summarized my editorial instincts to David Fong in 3 sentences that were more precise and more flattering than anything I would have said about myself. David Fong gave me his card. I emailed him the following Monday at 9:15 a.m. By November 2015, I had left the Valencia Street publisher and joined his agency as an associate agent. This is the professional trajectory I want to trace briefly because it is relevant to what came later and because the honest version of this story requires you to understand that what Edmund left me was not simply an inheritance. It was the cumulative result of 11 years in which he consistently pointed me toward rooms I would not have entered alone. By December 2019, I was a full agent at the Fong Literary Agency, earning $94,300 per year, with a client list of 14 writers and 2 books on the New York Times list in the same calendar year. I was 29 years old. I had a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment in the inner Sunset 3 blocks from Edmund's house, where I had dinner with him every Thursday evening at 6:30 p.m., and where we argued about books and architecture, and whether the city had changed for better or worse, and whether Margaret's garden in the back needed a professional, or whether he could manage it himself, which he could not. I called my parents on birthdays and at Christmas. The calls were warm in the particular way that calls are warm when both parties have agreed, without negotiating it explicitly, to remain on the surface of things. Daniel called more often than I did, which my mother mentioned occasionally, in the way that people mention things they consider relevant data. I noted the mentions and said nothing about them because I had, by my late 20s, arrived at something I can only describe as a settled understanding of what those calls were and were not, and I had stopped expecting them to be something different. Edmund was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March 2022. He called me on a Thursday morning at 8:47 a.m. Our usual dinner was not until evening, so a morning call was unusual, and I knew from the timing alone that something had shifted. He told me directly, in the first 30 seconds, what the diagnosis was and what the prognosis was, and then he said, "I want to have dinner tonight instead of waiting. There are some things I want to talk through with you." I said yes. I got off the phone and sat at my desk for 11 minutes. Then I opened my email and cleared my afternoon. Over the 14 months that followed, Edmund's health declined in the specific, nonlinear way that illness declines, periods of relative stability punctuated by developments that required reorganization, adjustment, the addition of new professionals to the landscape of his daily life. His attorney, a woman named Caroline Shee, who had managed his legal and financial affairs for 16 years, was present throughout this period in ways both formal and informal. It was Caroline Shee who called me on a Wednesday in June 2022 at 2:15 p.m. to inform me that Edmund had updated his estate plan and that she needed to verify certain details with me directly. She did not tell me the substance of what he had done. She asked me a series of administrative questions and confirmed my contact information and legal name with careful thoroughness, and the call lasted 14 minutes, and when it ended I sat with what I understood it to imply for a while before I called Edmund and told him I thought he had done something significant and asked if he wanted to tell me about it. He said, "Come to dinner on Thursday, and we'll talk about it properly." On Thursday evening, over the dinner he had made himself, he insisted on cooking through most of his illness, which was a form of stubbornness I had come to recognize as central to who he was. He told me what he had done. He had revised his will. He had no living relatives he was close to, his 2 siblings having predeceased him, and the distant family members who remained were people to whom he had left specific bequests in amounts he described as appropriate. The remainder of his estate, the house, the brokerage account, the art, he had left to me. I told him I didn't need him to do that. He said he knew I didn't need it. He said the question was a need. He said, "The question is who I want to have the things I've spent a life building. The answer is you." I want to be careful about what I felt in that moment because it would be easy and inaccurate to describe it as simply gratitude. What I felt was more complicated than gratitude. It was the specific disorientation of being seen in a way that your life has not prepared you to be seen, the feeling of someone pointing at you in a room and saying, "You. Not your brother. Not the easier one. You." Something inside me went very still, in the way that things go still when they finally recognize something they have been waiting for without admitting they were waiting. I thanked him. He said it wasn't necessary. We finished dinner. He told me the garden absolutely needed a professional, and I agreed, and we argued about which one for approximately 20 minutes, and then I drove home through the fog coming in over the park and sat in my car outside my building for a few minutes before going in. Edmund died on November 4th, 2024, at 6:22 a.m. at home, with a hospice nurse named Rosario present. I was there. I had been there for 3 days. The obituary ran in the Chronicle the following Sunday. Caroline Shee filed the initial probate documents on November 12, 2024 at 9:30 a.m. in San Francisco Superior Court, case number in my records. The estate process was, by the standards of these things, straightforward. Edmund had been meticulous about his affairs, which surprised nobody who had known him. My parents called my old number at 10:53 a.m. on the Sunday the obituary ran. 53 minutes after the paper would have been on their porch in Fresno, based on the delivery time I still remember from childhood. I know it was 53 minutes because Priya told me later that my mother had called her at 11:04 a.m., and my mother had said on that call that she had already tried me twice. I had changed my number 3 weeks earlier, on October 16th, when I switched carriers. It was an administrative decision, the kind that accumulates on a to-do list for months and finally gets resolved on a Tuesday afternoon between meetings. I had not notified my parents because I had, over the previous 2 years of Edmund's illness, reduced our contact to a level where the practical necessity of them having my current number had not presented itself. I am being honest about this. I am not saying the timing was entirely unconscious. I am saying I did not make the change in order to disappear, but when the change was made, some part of me noted that disappearing was now an available option and did not move to close it. Priya's text arrived at 10:47 a.m. I read it at the kitchen counter with my second cup of coffee. I set the phone down. I stood there for a while looking at the fog on the park, which was doing the thing it does on November mornings in the sunset, coming in low and flat, softening the edges of everything. My mother found my email address through my agency's website at 1:15 p.m. that same Sunday. The email arrived at 1:23 p.m. I read it at 3:40 p.m., after I had gone for a walk and come back and made lunch and read for an hour, which was the order in which I needed to do things before I was in the right state to read it. The email was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph expressed condolence, briefly and correctly. The second paragraph asked how I was doing and said my father sent his love. The third paragraph asked, with a careful but unmistakable directness, whether it was true that Edmund had left me his estate, and whether it would be possible for us to speak soon, as there were some family matters she wanted to discuss. I read it twice. I noted the architecture of it, how the condolence came first, how it was correctly placed and correctly sized, how the inquiry about the estate arrived in the third paragraph rather than the first, how the phrase family matters was doing significant work in that sentence without specifying what family matters meant. I recognized it as a careful email. I recognized the care as a form of information. I forwarded it to Caroline She at 4:02 p.m. with a single line. For your awareness. Caroline replied at 4:44 p.m. Understood. I'll note it in the file. No action required from you at this time. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. I did not reply to my mother's email that day. I didn't reply the following day either. On the third day, a Tuesday, I sat at my desk at 8:30 a.m. and wrote a response that took me 4 drafts and approximately 50 minutes. The final version was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph thanked her for her condolences and said that I was doing as well as could be expected. The second paragraph said that I was happy to speak with her when I felt ready and that I would be in touch when that time came and that I hoped she and my father were well. I did not say when that time would be. I did not invite her to estimate. 3 days later, on a Friday morning, Daniel called me on a number he found through a mutual friend. It was 9:14 a.m. I was at my desk. I looked at the screen for 2 full rings before I decided to answer. He said my name when I picked up and then he said, "Mom's been trying to reach you." I said I knew. He said, "She just wants to talk." I said I understood. He said, "Irina, we're family. Whatever he left you, that doesn't change that we're family." I want to be precise about what I felt when Daniel said that sentence, because I think it is the sentence that contains the most information in this entire story. Not the estate, not the obituary, that sentence. Whatever he left you, that doesn't change that we're family. I sat with it for a moment, and then I said, very evenly, "I know we're family, Daniel." And then I said, "I'll be in touch when I'm ready." And then I said goodbye, and I ended the call. I put the phone on my desk. I looked at it for a second. Then I turned back to my computer and opened the manuscript I had been reading before the call, and I found the paragraph where I'd left off, and I kept reading. There was a sentence on that page. The writer was talking about the particular loneliness of being in a room full of people who don't see you, and I read it twice and I thought, yes, that's exactly it. That's the whole thing right there. My brother had gone to Oaxaca every summer for 6 years. He had received $1,850 per month for 3 months when his rent was difficult, without ever being told it was a favor. He had been the one they drove to Sacramento with a rented van because he was easier to bring, because I understood, because I had always understood, because I had made my entire childhood out of understanding. A man I met in a bookshop when I was 22 had listened to me speak for 2 hours and decided, over the 11 years that followed, that I was worth serious attention. He had introduced me to the person who changed my career. He had watched me become someone, and he had left me everything he had built, not because I was family, but because he had chosen me deliberately, revocably at any point, and then finally irrevocably, as the person he trusted with the things that had mattered to him. The contrast between those two facts sat in me quietly for a long time. It sits there still. I have spoken to my mother once since the obituary ran. It was a phone call in January 2025, 10 weeks after Edmund's death, which I initiated on a Wednesday morning at 10:30 a.m. after deciding that I was ready to have it. The call lasted 31 minutes. She said she was sorry for my loss. I said thank you. She asked about the estate. I said it was being handled by Caroline She, and that everything was proceeding correctly. She said she had been thinking about what it would mean for our family going forward. I said I had been thinking about that too. She asked what I had concluded. I told her I had concluded that I loved her and my father, and that I was not in a position right now to have the conversation she wanted to have, and that I would let her know when I was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You always did understand more than you let on." I said yes. I think I do. The house in the Sunset is mine now. I have dinner there on Thursdays out of a habit I am not ready to relinquish. Edmund's garden does, in fact, need a professional. I hired one in December, a woman named Sonia, who comes on the first and third Friday of every month at 8 a.m. and who has so far made no comment about the state of the roses, which I appreciate. I walk through the room sometimes in the evenings, when the light is right, and I think about what it means to be chosen. Not found, not accommodated, not brought along because the logistics happen to work. Chosen. Actively, deliberately, with full knowledge of the alternatives. I think about the difference between being easy to bring and being worth bringing. I think about the 11-year-old on Millbrook Drive who watched her family pack for Oaxaca and said okay, and about the 33-year-old standing in a house in the Sunset that belongs to her now, who has learned, slowly, imperfectly, with the help of a man who is no longer here, how to say something other than okay. Love does not mean you are always chosen, but it should mean that sometimes. It should mean that at least once someone in the room looks at the inventory of their life and points at you specifically and says, "You. Everything I built, you." Caroline, she completed the final probate filing on March 3, 2025, at 2:30 p.m. The estate transferred cleanly, as Edmund had intended. I have not yet decided what to do with the brokerage account. I have decided to keep the house. The roses, according to Sonia, are going to be fine with some attention, which I think is true of most things. There is something worth knowing for anyone navigating the specific difficulty of a family that has treated one child as easier and another as the default, which is that the damage done by this pattern is real and has a name in family therapy literature. It is called parentification in its more extreme forms, but even in its subtler forms, the daughter who says okay, the child calibrated out of the itinerary. The research is clear that the effects accumulate and that they are worth examining with professional support rather than simply absorbing as weather. A therapist who specializes in family systems dynamics can help you distinguish between the habit of accommodation and an actual preference, and that distinction turns out to matter quite a lot. I am in therapy. I have been for 4 years. I mention this not as advice, but as a fact about my life that I no longer feel any particular need to make invisible. If you were in my place, if a stranger had chosen you in the way Edmund chose me, and your family called within the hour of finding out, would you have answered that first call from your mother? Or would you have done what I did, and waited until you were sure you were ready? I'm not certain I made the right call, but for the first time in a long time it was entirely mine to make.